Thank you very much, John. And let me just set up my presentation. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I'd like to thank I4P for the invitation. I think they're doing very important work by bringing ideas to a wider audience, and I'm very grateful to John Diamond and also to Danny Harkness for facilitating me and getting me here today. My own background is I'm at the moment in Ulster University, but for 5 years I worked with an independent think tank focused on the issue of economic inequality called TASK in the Republic of Ireland. And as part of that, I had the experience of dealing with a lot of people who've got an analysis of economic inequality. So what I really want to do today is to share with you some of what I've learned and to give you my take or my analysis on the whole issue of economic inequality. So that'll take us through the first half of the talk. And then in the second half, I want to start off by looking at income inequality, but in the second half, I'm going to get into my analysis of why we need to think broader, as John suggested, not just about the narrow economic definition of income inequality, but this wider sense of how economic inequality is really a social phenomenon and it affects things that are very difficult to measure for traditional economics. So I'm going to bring that in as well in the second half. What you see here is a picture from Rio de Janeiro. It's a classic division of rich and poor. We have a luxury apartment block with each balcony has a swimming pool that someone can lounge in and look down at their neighbours below in the poor area, sweltering in the heat. And so the story of rich and poor is as old as history. So is there anything new in this story of economic inequality? Is it just the same old, or is there something new? Well, I want to argue there is very much something new. What we're looking at with economic inequality is the distribution of income across the whole of society. We're not focusing in on poverty, nor are we focusing in exclusively on the wealthy, although we'll talk about both of those. But we're talking about the whole distribution of income, of wealth, of other economic assets and resources across the whole of society. And that changes our perspective on the issue. The kind of whole of economy focus makes it easier to see how poverty and wealth and everything in between are all connected as part of a larger system. So I'm going to need to take you through some of the economic jargon. I hope to do that as painlessly as possible, to take you through some of the methods that are used that allow us to describe income inequality in the first instance. You know, where are these numbers coming from? Are they reliable? And having done that, we'll go further into the wider issues of economic inequality. Most of our information is on income. As I said, it comes from survey data. It comes from very large scale. Thousands of people are asked every year about their household income. That's their income from their job, but also from maybe rental income, bank interest, cash benefits, any other income they have. So we've got very good information from surveys about household income in the UK and in many other countries, and that gives us a good basis to talk about society. We know there are limitations about survey data. It's a bit weak when it comes to very low incomes and also very high incomes, as we'll see later on. We also know a little bit about wealth inequality. Again, there's some survey data and also some other data looking at people's tax returns and so on, and we'll come back to that. The current concern, when we talk about inequality, it's not that we're concerned to create mathematical perfect equality in some sort of utopian world, but there's a widespread concern about the extent of inequality, the growth, the rapid growth of inequality, and some extreme cases of income inequality, which have all beginning to set off warning lights for economists and others who are concerned with, you know, where is our society going? So before we get more into income, I just want to sort of sow a seed for what I'm going to talk about in the second half about the complexity. This is a quote here from Cameron, not the Prime Minister, but a sociologist of the same name, although it's a bit like a political slogan. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And it's obvious in some ways that the pictures here remind us if you haven't got your health, you know, what does anything else matter? We can't put a price on the time we spend with our children, especially when they're young, or indeed when we're older and we look forward to their call. But At the same time, as we say that certain aspects of human life cannot be measured, they have a subjective value that's different for each person. At the same time, they are measured. When we go to put our children in a creche, or we're looking to pay for nursing home care or for supplementary health care, prices are put on these things. But what I want to really tease out is this idea that we only measure the value that we create in other people's lives when money exchanges hands, and they become part of what we measure in the formal economy. And yet the same value can be created, or indeed more value, when we parent at home, do unpaid work at home, or otherwise, helping others, sharing with others. So you've got this idea of the wider society and the smaller economy within it. But at the same time, I am a social scientist, so I'm keen to see what can we measure and what can we conceptualize in ways that assist us in our understanding of the social world and the economic world. So I'm proposing this model of economic inequality. We need to look not just at people's net income, their money position after tax and benefits, but also assets defined in a very broad sense, all of the different resources people can call upon, both money but also networks of friends and family, their own education and many other assets. And also this issue of cost of living, which I argue is not properly measured by our current system. And I'll come to that. My argument is if we could somehow measure all three of these things, we capture the overall set of economic benefit or benefits that each individual has, the resources they have to do well in our economy. And then if we measured the distribution of these benefits across society, we'd have a much more nuanced sense of economic inequality, not just income inequality, but a broader sense of how well are people likely to do, or indeed how badly. And I'd argue that we would find that income inequality doesn't match up exactly with this broader sense of economic inequality. So to take a simple example, someone could have a low income, but if they own their own home outright with no mortgage, they're in a very different situation to somebody with a low income who has to pay a high rent. But there's many other examples, and I'll try and tease that out. But for now, I want to focus on just income and the income side, because that's where we have more information and we can tell a more detailed story. This is a helpful diagram from the Office of National Statistics, and it reminds us that there's different ways of defining income. Even income is not straightforward. Do we want to talk about the salaries and wages that people get from employment? That's one part, before tax, after tax. But we also have to look at other income people have. They might have a rental income, they might have, again, money from dividends, from shares, from bank interest. So there's lots of different forms of income, which form, if you like, people's gross earnings, their original income. People may get benefits from the cash system. So that's something which is gross income or taxable, so before tax, but then after tax. And indeed, you might include other benefits people get from health and education to a final income. So there's different ways of measuring income. We're going to focus on disposable income, people's net income after tax and after they've received any benefits they're going to get, as well as all the money they get from the marketplace. A lot of analysis is done looking at individual adults, but we're going to focus on households because I think it gives us a better sense of society. Our society is not composed of a bunch of individual adults, but indeed of families and households of people living together. And I think that's really the unit we need to focus on when it comes to understanding economic inequality. Two more bits of technicalities to hit you with before we get into the numbers. This is this idea of dividing society or a group into quantities or quantiles. So here, a classic is we divide everybody into groups, each of the same size, 10 different groups. So for example, people on the lowest 10% in terms of income, all the way up to the 10% with the highest incomes on average. So we have the average for each group. We sometimes have quintiles, which are taking 20% groups. And again, this is a very standard way of measuring the differences in income between, say, top income groups and bottom income groups. So again, that's just a standard way in which we understand, who's got more income, who's got less. The final technicality here is this thing called equivalization. So I mentioned earlier that the cost of living is different for different people. Obviously, if you have a single person on an income of £1,000, that person is in a very different situation from a couple with 2 children who are also trying to live on £1,000. You have more mouths to feed, you need a bigger place to live, more clothes and other expenses. So economists do something very simple to just equalise out the income distribution, so to allow us to compare singles with couples and to compare families with children without children. So what we do is we just count the first adult as 1, the second adult is counted as a half, because a couple living together can share a lot of costs, so they don't need the same amount of money as 2 individual adults who need 2 places to live and so on. Older children are counted as half, younger children are counted as 0.3. But don't worry about the technicalities, it's just to fill you in. So in real money, £1,000 is unchanged if you're a single person. But if we have our family here with an older child and a younger child, £1,000 for them gives them the spending power of £435. So they could both have the same income, but obviously the family is worse off. And that's fairly intuitive. In a similar way, we have this single mother and daughter, 2-person household, so £1,000 for them gives them the spending power of £769. Again, they have to stretch that money further to have the same standard of life. Okay. It's a crude way to deal with the cost of living, and again, I'll be complaining about that in the second half, but it's important to realise because it's used all the time. It's a standard part of how we understand the income distribution, how we measure poverty, and so on. So what do we know about inequality? We're going to look at some standard measurements. We're going to look at the UK population mostly. I'm going to touch on the United States and a couple of other countries. And again, we'll be dividing the population into groups of 10%, from the lowest income 10% to the highest income 10%. It's not the origin of the left-right divide, but it might as well be. We'll have the low income on the left and the high income on the right from where you're sitting. And here is the distribution of disposable household income in the UK. So as you can see, it's very striking that this group here, the top 10%, they have a good deal more income than everybody else. So after tax, they have an income of around £84,000. The next highest group, again, the average income here is £50,000. It's not to say every family has £50,000, but on average, households in this group have £50,000, all the way down to the bottom, where the lowest 10% group have an average income after tax of €9,277. And every pound counts in that for people in this situation. So that gives you an idea of just the crude distribution of income. And just to show you where those numbers are coming from, the blue bar here is your market income. So most people are getting most of their money through wages, salaries, and other incomes from the economy, rental incomes and so on, as I mentioned. The red is the cash benefits that everybody gets. So for example, child benefit might be got by any family, regardless of where it is on the income ladder, although new rules have sort of changed some of the tax credits that you get at the highest incomes. The green indicates how much tax and national insurance each group has paid. So you can get a sense of how much tax people are paying relative to the size of their income. And again, it's all averages of each of these deciles, these 10% groups. So somebody in the top is paying a lot of tax, but then again, they are taking really an awful lot of income. So it makes sense that they should pay tax, and indeed, perhaps they could pay a little bit more relative to their income, whereas people in the middle are paying a lump of tax, which might be indeed an equivalent percentage of their income is paid in tax and national insurance. Now, here we go back to our disposable income, but it's been equivalised. That idea that we've evened out between singles and families and so on, so that we can really compare the whole population here. And this is your basic distribution. It's only slightly different from the purple one, but it's the highest of the high incomes is slightly lower when you equivalize. It goes down beneath the 80,000 mark. It's about 6,000 less, because what's happened in reality is more families are clustered in the middle, more single people are clustered, or couples, 2 couples both with a good job tend to be clustered at the high end. In fact, it's surprising how rare in our society it is for there to be a couple where both partners have what we regard as a good job, maybe £40,000 or more. That's pretty much a ticket to the top 10%. because again, it's a household income. So if the couple, if you have 80,000 after tax, if you both have 40,000 after tax, well, actually, you're going to be in the top 10%. So there is an issue that to a certain extent, we're comparing some households who have two incomes with other households who only have one income. But that's the lived reality in our society, where many households can't get one full-time job, never mind getting two decent full-time jobs for couples. And indeed, of course, single parents can only have one full-time job. Isn't that enough? But yet they find themselves in the lower half of the income distribution. So let's push that over to the side and have a look again at our groups of 10, our 10% groups. So how much money do they have relative to each other? Because it's one thing to say how much money you have in absolute terms, but the standard measurements we use are the top 10% has a quarter of all income, equivalised, disposable after-tax income. The bottom 10% has just 3% of all income. So there's that inequality. The top 10% has 8.6 times more than the bottom 10%. So that's one way of looking at inequality. But maybe that's skewed by, some exceptionally high incomes in the top group, some exceptionally low incomes in the bottom group, or people with no income. So we often compare the top 20% with the bottom 20%. And when we do that, we find that the top group has 5.3 times more than the bottom group in terms of income. The top has 2.4 times more than the middle, and the middle has 2.2 times the bottom. And again, these three in particular are very much the standard measurements used when looking at income inequality in different economies to understand which economies are more or less equal. So these are some facts, but many people ask, well, so what? Is this just the politics of envy? Is it just that statistics are hiding people at different stages of life, or is this necessary to drive our economy forward? And if we had a more equal economy, would the economy indeed grind to a halt? These are all the sort of issues raised, and I hope to deal with those as we go through. When we look at this over time, we learn something extra, in the sense that taking 1977 as a base year, where it's seen as 1 or 100%, what we see is that the red line here, which is that gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. So we saw a moment ago that the top 20% has 5.3 times the income of the bottom group. That's today, but in the past, that was a lower gap. So starting in 1977 as a base year, that inequality grew a lot in the late 70s and into the 1980s, at the time of the liberalisation of the UK economy, indeed the American economy and many other economies. In a similar way, the gap between somebody at the threshold of joining the top 10% and someone at the threshold of the bottom 10%, again, that income gap, we see exactly the same pattern. So that somebody in the top, that gap has grown by nearly 23%, whereas the gap between the top 20% and the bottom 20% has grown by 30%. So very large changes in the economy. Well, some people still say, well, what if the top have more, if those at the bottom can meet their needs? So the next thing I want to look at is poverty. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to skip over a couple of slides because we're going to see the same information again. How much money do you need not to have to be considered in poverty versus how much money do you need to be in the top 10%? And of course, it's different for different household types. So for a single person, you're considered to be in poverty if you've less than £18,500. That's real money compared to the equivalised number, 18,500, because it's the same for single people. And for a single person, in real money terms, they need to have 54,000 after tax to be in the top 10%. It's actually not a huge gap between being in the bottom, being in poverty, which is the bottom 35% of the UK, and being in the top. And again, this is not the top 10% versus bottom 10%, it's the top 10% versus those considered to be in poverty, which is a great deal more than just 10%, it's about 30% of the UK. But when you come to, for example, this single parent and a young child, to be in poverty, if they have less than £24,000 a year after tax, they would be considered to be in poverty because they have 2 mouths to feed. And likewise, to join the top 10%, they'd need 70,000. That's in real money terms, because of course we're dealing with real money versus equivalised money, which I hope makes sense. Likewise, our family, they would be considered in poverty if they've less than £42,000 a year after tax, because they have 4 mouths to feed. So it's quite easy to see that the more children you have, it's very easy to be in poverty, mathematically in this way. People quibble about that. They say, well, are they actually feeding and clothing themselves, adequately? Is it really poverty? It's one way to measure poverty, which is to say that they're less than 60% of average income. We also have other ways of measuring poverty about deprivation. Can people afford to put hot food on the table? But this is a standard measurement used across the world to indicate, income poverty. And likewise, a couple would be considered in poverty if they had less than 14,000 each after tax. They can share costs, and likewise, they're considered in the top 10% if they've £40,675 in real money after tax. So again, there's not a huge gap between being in poverty and being in the top 10%. Of course, more than half of the UK population is in between, is in the middle. There's about 30 to 40% of people in poverty, 50% of people in the middle, and then 10% of people in the top 10%, of course. So again, it gives you a sense of the spread of income. At this point, you might say, could we not just have one number that indicates to us the overall level of inequality in the economy? It'd be much easier just to follow. And the good news is we can. If the number is 0, we have a situation of perfect equality. So if it's close to 0, everybody has more or less the same income. If it's close to 1, one person has all of the income, and it's a totally or perfectly unequal situation. So this is this number that has been developed. It's called the Gini coefficient. It's named after an Italian economist called Gini. And the UK Gini coefficient is 32.6, sometimes written as 0.326. So that's our measurement of overall inequality in the UK. I'm not going to get into the technicalities, but there's a technical way in which the distribution of income is looked at in order to calculate, what is the Gini coefficient. I'm happy to take more technical questions at the end, but I want to drive on to some more interesting material as we go. So let's look at the Gini coefficient over time. Again, starting with the base year of 1977, we see the same pattern. So that gives us confidence that Gini is measuring inequality in the same way as those other statistics, but it's handy because it's just one number, and it allows us to see, again, the growth of inequality in the 1980s. It has come down somewhat, but it tends to ebb and flow with the economy. When the economy is booming, there tends to be a growth of inequality, and the risk is certainly that if the economy continues to grow, we'll continue to see ever more inequality as part of that growth. So that's the risk of the question. But in fairness, the peak of inequality that we saw in the early 90s has not yet been repeated in the UK. So something has happened in our economy, the liberalisation of our economy certainly, that is driving higher inequality. But we can also compare the UK to other countries, namely countries in the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is a research institute that it's seen also as an organisation that only the wealthiest countries can afford to join or do join. So it gives us an idea of the richest countries in the world. And when we look at those countries and say, well, where is the UK? The UK here is the red bar, and it's the 5th most unequal country in the world, in the Western world, or the developed world, in terms of market incomes before we count taxes or social benefits, transfers, pensions, and so on. So the UK is more unequal. More unequal again is Chile, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland is the most unequal. The UK is marginally more unequal than France, Spain, and the United States. Over on the other end, the market distribution of income is much more equal in Korea, Switzerland, Iceland, Netherlands, Norway, and so on. So you have very different economies. This has nothing to do with the state, because this is just companies paying salaries, people drawing, interest on their dividends, and so on. So This is the market situation. But when we look at the picture after taxes and transfers, there are some important differences. I mean, the first good news is that overall inequality goes down. In the first picture, it's averaging here about over 0.45 or 45 on the Gini coefficient. So inequality is much higher. The average then drops to around 0.3 or 30. That's good news. The welfare state is alive and well because of taxation, but in particular, because taxation doesn't do so much on its own, the paying of benefits, pensions, benefits to people who have disabilities, who can't work, benefits to people who are unemployed, benefits to carers. Those cash benefits have a huge impact right across the developed world in reducing market inequality. So that's the good news. The bad news for the UK is that the UK is still here among the most unequal. So although taxes and benefits help, they don't help as much in the UK as they do certainly in other European countries, because when it comes to the European Union, the UK has the highest rate of inequality after tax and benefits, bar none. More unequal, you have Israel, Russia, the United States, Turkey, Mexico and Chile. But what about Ireland? They were so unequal. What happened to them? Well, they've moved to the middle of the pack. Ireland's a low tax country, so that doesn't do much, but it has relatively generous cash payments. It doesn't have so many pensioners either, so the state pension is much higher than the UK. Unemployment benefits tend to be about cash because there's no National Health Service in the Republic, and so the public services are weaker, but there's more cash payments. And that cash payment reduces the inequality. So that's what's happening there. And what we see over the most equal countries after tax and transfers, Denmark, Slovenia, Slovakia, Norway, Czech Republic, Iceland. What we're seeing is some of the Nordic social democratic countries and also some of the small new entrants to the European Union. And there's different dynamics going on. In some of them, they've got a very strong welfare state in those Nordic countries. In others, they have a relatively young economy and they're starting from a more equal basis as they begin to build their economy. So while there is good news that the welfare state is doing its job across the OECD, there's a risk that there's increasing pressure against taxation. And there's as we'll see later, public opinion is turning against paying cash benefits to people. There's a whole culture now of accusing those on cash benefits of not deserving them. And that's very dangerous because it undermines this ability to radically reduce inequality in our societies. I want to now move to a different source of data. I mentioned earlier that this survey data, which gives us these statistics, doesn't really capture the very rich. Those not only in the top 10%, but top 1% and indeed 0.1 and so on. This is an illustration from a movie called Inequality for All, starring Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labour in the Clinton administration. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I recommend it to you. It's a great documentary. And he compares this diagram to a suspension bridge. It is the income share, including capital gains, of the top 1% in the USA. And as you can see in the roaring 20s, just before the Wall Street crash, the Great Depression and World War II, the income share of the top 1% was 23% of all income and capital gains. It's back there again. Well, it was there just before the 2008 crash, and that crash really hasn't dented it much, and it's on the rise again. After the war, we had a 30-year period in the 50s, 60s and 70s where the 1% share was about 10%, so half what it is now. And that was a time of great economic growth, prosperity, despite the fact that income tax rates were as high as 92% in the United States for incomes above $1 million. And indeed, it was only with Reagan that they were brought down to 35%. They were in the 70s at that point. So the United States was a much more egalitarian system at that time. But we've seen, obviously, the total change from the 1980s in terms of the 1% income share. And crucially, this information is not survey data, it's based on tax records. meticulous, detailed going through the tax returns and the statistics generated by the tax authorities. It's obviously anonymous, but nonetheless we can see how much money people in this income group are declaring, and we can get a picture, a much more reliable picture of top incomes from this source of information. Reich tries to explain this in a number of ways. In 1978, he's comparing here the typical male worker. We've more data available on male workers, hence the focus on men, was $48,000 in today's money, adjusted for inflation. The income of a typical 1% CEO was $393,000. So a CEO back in the late 70s took 8 times the income of a typical male worker in the US economy. What we see today, well, 2010, first of all, 2 changes. The typical male worker today is earning only 3/4 what he would have earned in the 70s, at nearly $34,000. So average wages have gone down in real terms, people's ability to buy goods and services. Whereas CEOs are taking on average in the top 1%, 1.1 million in salaries, bonuses, pensions and so on. 33 times that of the typical worker. So Reich is pointing to this and saying, well, there's obviously been the rise of executive pay, of high pay for business owners, CEOs, and the like. Reich also points to the fact that the trade unions in the private sector in the United States, which were strong, declined in the 1970s, and their decline almost matches the rise of this inequality between top pay and typical workers' pay. Another explanation that Reich points to is the question of productivity. So there's 2 lines here, one is lying on top of the other. From the 1950s, workers' productivity rose. So real value was created by workers by sort of working better, innovating, generating a greater return on investment, a return to companies. Companies were making money. And workers were getting their fair share of that growth. So as productivity grew, wages grew to the same extent. And that match stops in about 1972. Productivity has continued to rise in the United States. So workers are still, adding value and increasing profits, and companies are productive. And economists measure productivity in various ways. But pay has essentially stagnated for the middle American worker since the 1970s in real terms. So that they're getting paid today more or less what they were getting paid 40 years earlier. You might ask, but haven't people's living standards improved? Well, obviously technology has changed, and technology lets us do more things now than we could in the past. That has helped. But the way in which Americans have managed to stay ahead is people work longer hours to get more money. So they were working more to earn more because otherwise they would fall behind. Women entered the workforce enormously from the 1970s. The 2-income household has become the norm, because if you don't have 2 incomes, you're going to be in poverty, whereas in the 70s and 60s, 1 income could feed a household. And people took on debt, which was the last episode of this. We saw a huge amount of debt for mortgages, which of course led to that subprime mortgages, the banks, the financialization of these mortgages, which led to the 2008 crash. So that's how Americans have stayed ahead. But there has been a wage freeze, if you like, for many Americans for a very long time. Okay, I may have to speed up. I hope you're doing okay so far. So I want to now look at this World Wealth and Incomes database, freely available online, where all this tax information has been put up. I'm going to compare 4 countries. The UK, the United States, Germany and Denmark. I've chosen these because each of them tells a story that represents a group of countries. So we've seen the UK. When you look only at tax information on market incomes, the top 10% have nearly 40% of all income. But it's like Russian dolls. You think you know the story right. The top 10%, they have all the money. But when you look inside this group, you find a smaller doll called the top 1%. And they have nearly 13% of the income. So that's a group who are a good deal richer than the rest of the top 10%. And when you open that group up and look inside, you see the top 0.1% who have 4.6% of all income. So 1 in 1,000 people in the UK have basically £1 out of every 20 in income. So 1 out of 1,000, get £1 out of every 20. That's the level of inequality. We don't know for the top 0.01% in the UK, we don't have that information, but we do have it for the other countries. When we look at the United States, we see that on the whole it's more unequal than the UK. The top 10% take nearly half of all income from the market. The top 1% are taking nearly 18%, the top 0.1, 7.5%, and the top 0.01%, 1 in 1,000, are taking $3 out of every 100. When we look at Germany, we actually see a similar pattern to the UK. It's even more unequal in Germany than the UK, but of course Germany is different because they have a much higher rates of taxation. So although people are paid this, their take-home income isn't going to be as high. And then Denmark is a very interesting case. It's a smaller country. We might expect not to see such extremes. But at the same time, even for those very top salaries, there's nothing like the concentration of income at the top. So their businesses, their society, have chosen to pay people at the top a good deal less. It's not socially acceptable there. It's not happening there to the same extent that it's happening elsewhere, which is a pattern we see in the social democratic and Nordic countries, although even there, inequality is rising very quickly, but from a low base. So again, we can see that over time. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but you can see again that dip, a period of lower inequality, and then it rises again. The USA, we have data on Britain from the 90s. Very similar pattern in Britain to the United States. This is for the top 10%. In Germany in red, we see the same shape, slightly lower. And then Denmark is going in a different direction. And again, we see similar shapes, similar patterns for the top 1%, the top 0.1%, and indeed the top 0.01%. So I think I've made that point. Of course, if you've got a very large income and you're generating a surplus, that becomes wealth. And what we see when we turn to information about wealth rather than income is that those at the top have even more wealth as a share of wealth than they do in their share of income. So we see that the top 0.1% in the United States have, at this time, 23% of all wealth. So 1 in 1,000 Americans have 23%, or nearly $1 in every 4 in the United States in terms of wealth. That's land, property, cash, financial assets, shares, stocks, you name it, the whole package of assets, financial assets or wealth assets. If we look at the bottom 90% in America, we see the curve goes in the other direction. From a height in the 80s of having nearly 35% or more of all wealth, that 90% now is down to about 22% of wealth. So it's saying people have maybe lower home ownership, or the homes they own are worth a lot less now than they were. People have less cash savings. They have less resources generally across society. So people are getting sucked dry in terms of the resources that used to be there in the American middle class that aren't there anymore. What do we know about the UK? It's not as bad. The top 10% have 45% of all wealth, and everybody else shares 55% between them. And when we look at what that means in real terms, someone in the middle has a wealth of about £225,000. Most that's probably going to be home ownership. Someone at the bottom on average is going to have an average wealth of £12,000. There's going to be people's property, people's things. And of course it's an average, so some people will have nothing, no wealth, others will have some wealth. In the top 10%, total wealth of about £1 million. The top 1%, total wealth of nearly £2.9 million. And it's not just London house prices, it's also financial assets. Private pensions are 40% of this wealth, and so on. That's where the wealth is concentrated at the top. And of course, we give generous tax breaks to the people's ability to generate private pension pots for themselves. Okay, I'm conscious that I'm throwing a lot of information and numbers at you, so I want to now get into the question of where's this all coming from? What's going on? What are the causes of inequality? Well, there are many. I try and avoid words like globalization because I think it's just too big a catch-all phrase. We need to look at specifics such as the move from manufacturing, which is often unionized, to services economy, which is often not unionized. Right across the Western world, there's been outsourcing of manufacturing, a change to a services economy. Also the fact of the huge growth of the financial sector and the financialization of the economy has played a role in explaining the growth of inequality. We've seen asset booms in land and housing, the exploitation of natural resources like oil. We've seen fortunes made with new technologies like telecommunications and the internet. We've seen technology rendering whole occupations obsolete. Sort of, middle-paying jobs are being removed. Typists and clerks in offices don't exist anymore as roles because of computer programming has replaced the work that used to be done by people by a machine. Likewise, we see robotization in many factories in terms of how manufacturing has changed. Social change matters. As we have a higher rate of divorce and a greater number of single families, you have a situation where a family, as would have had one home. Now the same people need to have two houses to meet the same needs. So as society changes in terms of family makeup, that affects the distribution of income and resources as well and stretches what's available. There's also been a concerted rate on high taxation, as I mentioned. Inheritance has played a role, and also greed. As captured by the 1987 film Wall Street and the motto, "Greed is good," there was, serious economists indeed, and others have talked about the idea that greed motivates people to work harder, to get ahead. There was a culture of encouraging greed, incentives for people. Although there's plenty of evidence that would show that a CEO is not going to be more productive for 10 million a year compared to 1 million a year, but nonetheless, there's this insistence on paying people more and more when they're already at the top. Just on inheritance in the UK, as you might expect, those at the top get more than 3/4 of all inheritance. So we see an intergenerational transfer of wealth in the UK, which helps keep people at the top, and most people in the bottom 40% receive very little inheritance. Okay, what I want to get to now is, why does all this matter? There's been a lot of analysis done from various people trying to explain, well, this inequality is happening. It looks like it might be a bad thing, but what are the implications of this? And it's, as you can see, there's a lot of different causes of this inequality. So it's a complex picture. These are two pictures from Oxfam. They're looking at the whole world scene, and as you can see there, the top 1% in the world is now richer than the rest of the world in terms of the wealth that's held. Of course, by the top 1% of the world, it's probably analogous to the top 10% or more in the rich world. The 85 richest people, I think it's now down to 68, have the same wealth as half the world's population, 3.5 billion people, when you compare sort of dollar for dollar. So that's a concern. So obviously, there's a picture of, there are countries which still experience absolute poverty. There are countries where there is lack of food, where many people go malnourished. So that's the global scene that Oxfam are pointing at. But they're also looking at our economic models in the West and how that affects all this. In particular, they have a focus on the tax havens. 100 billion found, I think, in one of the oldest tax havens, and it's still there, hasn't been rounded up by the tax authorities. Tax dodging, which Christian Aid has talked about. This practice where companies are obeying the law, but they're finding so many loopholes so that they can avoid paying corporation tax, or individuals can avoid paying personal tax, inheritance tax. And that tax dodging has the effect that many developing countries can't build up their tax base. Therefore, they can't pay for infrastructure. They can't build up their own social services, because although aid is given, much more than aid is lost to the tax avoidance of the multinational corporations that are active in these countries. So the whole global economy has been called into question by the likes of Oxfam and Christian Aid. And of course, it's not just developing countries. We've seen in the UK public outrage about Starbucks, about Amazon, about other major household names and brands which have used loopholes. Again, this idea of tax dodging. they may have obeyed the letter of the law, but the public perceive that they make huge profits and pay next to no taxation, and people want these loopholes closed. And indeed, the OECD is working on a project to create a new global tax treaty to close as many of these loopholes as possible. But then the UK, like other economies, has many tax havens, like Jersey and Guernsey, the Isle of Man, the British Cayman Islands, and others, which are part of the UK model. The Republic of Ireland had something called the double Irish, where money would be transferred via Ireland to Bermuda in a way that allows the big multinationals based in Ireland to avoid taxes. The Dutch have something called the Dutch sandwich, using the Sandwich Islands. Again, the big economies are linked into tax havens as part of their business models, as part of normal tax planning by big companies. So all of this has been called into question. A different analysis, focusing on wealth, comes from Thomas Piketty from the Paris School of Economics. He's taken the long view. He wrote this book, Capital, in the 21st century. It was an unusual bestseller. It's over 1,000 pages in French, about 800 in the English translation. And it was a bestseller on right across America. He was on national TV in America and as well as in the UK and elsewhere. People buying this very large book in which he uses a lot of Jane Austen. He talks about French literature to describe the lifestyles of the super rich in the 17th and 18th century. And he combines it with an economic analysis of the incredible concentration of wealth that even if you've watched Downton Abbey a few times, it's hard to understand how some small number of people can have just so much wealth compared to everybody else. What he calls patrimonial capitalism. And he explains this in a very simple way. This equation, R is greater than G. If the return to capital is greater than the overall growth rate, then the rich will get richer. So if you imagine your economy is growing by 2%, so that the economy is 2% bigger, with that much extra value being created, which we can share out. But if the wealthy are making investments of millions and they're getting a 4% return, well, their return is bigger than growth. So they're getting that bit more than everybody else. And if that continues in the long term over the decades, we're going to see a return to that period of patrimonial capitalism. So again, this idea that R is going to return to being higher, that the rich will keep on getting richer, indeed have more. It's not the most efficient economic model. In fact, it's sclerotic. It's far less efficient. We have much more dynamic economy when growth is spread much more equally, as we saw in the 20th century, with such innovation and such advancements socially as well as economically. But there's kind of an inevitability to this grinding long-term mechanism that those bears in the economy that have huge wealth are just getting a bigger return than everybody else and slowly getting more. Unless, of course, they're tackled. Piketty proposes a global wealth tax, which people have said that's not going to work. But he's also very explicit that he's looking for other people to debate the possibilities. He leaves open what he calls part 4 of his book, where it's about how do we solve this. And it's going to need a lot of imaginative thinking. And of course, he's hearkening back to the world of capital that Karl Marx knew in the 19th century, where there was such an extreme concentration of wealth. Back to the OECD, this think tank that I mentioned. They're well respected. They've monitored the growth of inequality. They've got a whole project on that for about 10 or 15 years. And there's some landmark reports. But what's important is that it's backed by empirical research, detailed mathematical models and so on, showing the rise of inequality and what it means. They've shown the growing wage gaps. They've shown that trickle-down does not occur. The idea that, so what if the rich get rich? They spend their money, it goes down to the next layer of people, and they spend it goes down to the next layer of people. They've shown in their models it doesn't happen. And more in a global economy, of course, the rich get rich, they might invest outside of the country. That money doesn't go through the national economy. They've shown that inequality that we have now is at a tipping point. It could become a crisis, that it's weighing down economic growth. It's preventing the kind of economic growth we could have. And they've overturned the idea that you have to have a trade-off, more equality or higher growth. They've shown that if you do it right, you can have both a more equal economy and an economy that's growing faster and better. And what's important is that it's not just some research that some of their researchers have produced in a unit. Their Secretary General has stood up and said these things. It's the the whole organisation has backed these findings, which are radical in terms of mainstream economics, because they overturn a lot of the myths and received wisdom of how the economy works. Lots of other people have expressed concern. Robert Shiller won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2013. He called inequality the most important problem we are facing now today. He used his acceptance of the prize to say that. Alan Greenspan, who's an arch-libertarian Republican, has said that it's the most dangerous trend in the States. The International Labour Organization has talked about the need for wage-led growth, and they have, again, big models of the economy which show that you can increase wages and increase the growth in your economy by sharing that wealth and income more evenly. Even the IMF, which would be seen as kind of a hawkish organisation, has working papers of its staff, not the whole organisation, which show that inequality is damaging growth and we need to take it more seriously. As well as political leaders like Obama calling it a defining challenge. He's talking about the lack of social mobility for Americans. And the Pope talking about inequality as the root of social ills. And many other voices added to this concern. Some of you may have had the opportunity to attend the I4P annual lecture, heard Kate Pickett talk about the Spirit Level book that she wrote with Richard Wilkinson. And they're epidemiologists, and they found that more unequal societies, on the whole, tend to do worse. Higher rates of crime, worse obesity, various illnesses, worse health, which doesn't just affect those who are poor in that society, it affects the whole society. Average health levels are worse in societies that are more unequal. And of course, we see the UK as one of the more unequal societies, also with some of the worst outcomes in terms of social and health factors. Those findings have been reinforced by the influential Marmot report in the UK looking at health inequalities and others. Another concern, which is raised by Reich and also Joe Stiglitz in his work on inequality, is this idea of plutocracy, the rise of super rich people who can influence politics. The key things here are that for a long time corporates couldn't spend money in elections. But in 1976, the Supreme Court said spending money is a type of free speech to influence elections. And in 1978, they said companies can do it too. And by 2010, companies have the same rights as people to spend as much money as they want to influence elections. And they do. $6 billion, it's estimated, was spent in the US election in 2012. Nearly $1 billion was raised on behalf of the Obama camp alone, nearly $1 billion on behalf of the Romney side, over 1 million TV ads purchased, which of course pushes out the possibility of most people getting a foothold. Obama did raise a lot of money through micro donations, small scale donations from a great many people. But nonetheless, it's an issue. And we don't have time to go into the fundraising that's already gone on for this presidential election, but Jeb Bush, by autumn last year, had already raised $133 million. Hillary Clinton was just shy of $100 million. And that was only at the beginning of the presidential campaign. So hundreds of millions will be donated. Some will get mostly tiny donations, like Bernie Sanders. Others, like Trump, have not raised a lot, or hadn't raised a lot last year, but he came into the election with a personal wealth of $4.5 billion. The UK is not like that, I'm happy to say. The level of spending, the level of money raised by the political parties is nothing like the United States. There are a lot more rules and controls. But nonetheless, the parties do raise tens of millions or millions, and sometimes big companies, big individuals, big trade unions are donating hundreds of thousands. So there's millions in the case of trade unions on behalf of their members. So there's questions then raised about, do people have influence because they're donating large amounts of money? Media ownership, powerful lobby groups like the City of London, is money affecting our politics? Yes, in the UK, but not to the same extent as America, where money has gone crazy in the system. Public support for the welfare state is in decline, according to MORI, the opinion poll survey company. They have a nice part of the website called Generations, looking at generational change. In the late 80s, nearly 60% of people agree that the government should spend more money on welfare benefits, even if they have to have higher taxes. Today, that's down to 30%. People have changed their minds on higher taxes to pay for benefits for people who need them. And people who actively disagree has gone from 20% to over 40%. So across the whole society, public opinion is no longer as strongly in favour of the welfare state as it was. And yet we saw how important benefits are to reducing overall inequality. And that in turn, according to the OECD and others, is good for our economy. Puts more money out there, people have more spending power, keeps the economy going. And we see generations, pre-war, baby boomer, Generation X, Generation Y, younger generations, and every time a decline, a consistent decline over 10 years of survey in people's support for the welfare state. So maybe people here are young and they haven't yet started thinking about their pension or healthcare, but nonetheless, this is how they explain it's generational change. Younger people are not supporting the welfare state as much as older people. And that's something to do with how our society is more individualized, in line with how our economy has been more about the individual. We go to an extreme. Some people say, is the capitalist system sustainable? Communism fell and capitalism went crazy. And capitalism in turn is going to devour itself, some say. These are cartoons from the early 20th century, sort of illustrating this idea of, raising class consciousness among workers. That's an American trade union protest after the Second World War. Again, Piketty argues that the only reason we don't have the wealth inequality today is because of the Great Depression and the Second World War. So much wealth and capital was destroyed that we had to start again, and that allowed for the building of the welfare state as we know it. And it was out of these kind of movements, particularly in the post-war period, where enough is enough. After 2 world wars, we needed to change direction. We built the welfare state. The welfare state is now in decline. People are not supporting it. People don't want to pay taxes. Yet, could there be another movement against capitalism? We see some interesting parallels between the Occupy movement, whereas in the past it was the idea of educating the worker who was either a farmer or an industrial worker or whatever. It's now the 99%. It's the everybody, representing the diversity of our society, the diversity of our roles in the economy. We have more exact infographics about how wealth is distributed. And yet the Occupy movement seems to have faded away. Capitalism is still very much intact after the 2008 crash. We did not have another Great Depression. So at this point, I thought that's a lot of doom and gloom, a lot of concern. Is it all that bad? Or is there a danger of negative thinking, or of people sort of looking at the world and saying it confirms everything I've ever said, or catastrophic thinking about capitalism? There is that risk that people see the evidence that reinforces their own theory or their own analysis. But there are many people who see that inequality is the problem, but their solution is not less capitalism, but more of it. People like Alan Greenspan. It's a dangerous trend, but he would have more free markets to solve it, but at least recognises the danger of the trend. Whereas others would point to the need for higher taxation, regulation of markets, financial transaction tax, and a whole host of other possibilities. Well, there's some good news. There was not another Great Depression. There was a massive crash in 2008. When you look at the numbers, the scale was just eye-watering. And in terms of how national debts rose enormously to help offer a buffer. But technically, we dealt with it much better than we did with the Great Depression. The welfare state was still there to absorb the job losses. 800,000 jobs or more lost in the UK, but at least there was the welfare state to act as a cushion, to pick people up and get them back on their feet again. The economy is growing again, employment is growing again. So technology continues to improve, but nonetheless, all of the problems I've mentioned in relation to the growth of inequality remain. Possible solutions are complex and highly political. Now, I'm conscious that I'm running out of time, but it brings me on to the second half. It's a shorter half, it's a considerably shorter half. What I want to talk about here is complexity. What this frightening diagram is it's a timeline from the 1940s to today of the development of complexity science. Things like chaos theory and fuzzy logic and complex systems dynamics and things like that, facilitated greatly by the rise of computing power, which has allowed us to make much more complicated models. Like we now have the weather system, we also have big complicated computer models of the economy and of many other things. But I would point out that lots of our economic science, its fundamentals, were developed in the 19th century, before we really had this kind of understanding of complex systems, complex dynamics. And I think that strain, this is my own analysis, is that it's really beginning to show that we need to take a complex systems perspective on the economy to really understand the growth of inequality. Because our 19th century ideas about the economy and about human beings as economic actors just don't help us anymore in understanding the rise of inequality. There's this idea of complex social problems or wicked problems or messy social problems, which are all words meaning the same thing, formally complicated, technically complicated, mathematically complicated problems. And you can see they have common characteristics. Hard to define, many causes, instability, social complexity. Loads of organizations are responsible. Solutions involve changing people's behavior and people's ideas, which is very hard to do. Simple solutions, sort of narrow solutions, tend to make things worse rather than better, certainly have unforeseen consequences. And there tends to be chronic policy failure. Poverty, homelessness, climate change would be examples. Economic inequality, I'm arguing, is a really big, complex social problem understood in this way. Just to remind you, this is my simple model of a more sophisticated understanding of the benefits people get from the economy. Not just their income, but their assets understood in a wide sense, and the real variety in cost of living. Some of that is taken account of in economics, which talk about social capital, human capital. We saw the equivalization in relation to the cost of living, but it's not enough. These are all patches trying to repair a 19th century model of the economy. We need a very different model with a lot more data, and probably big rooms full of big computers. The problem that I see is that many people who are concerned about income inequality talk about getting people more income. Let's cut taxes and put more money in your pocket. Or, we have a living wage, which is a good thing to bring up the floor because it'll keep the economy going. These are good suggestions, well, some of them are good suggestions, but if you're only focusing here, you may have a situation where you're increasing somebody's income, but you're reducing the quality of public services, so their cost of living goes up because they have to pay more out of their own pocket. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. So that's not a solution. And a lot of these dynamics, are not taken account of with the narrow focus on income. So, what's the complexity that I want to introduce? I said we need to look at assets in this wide sense. It's not just people's money in terms of their savings or their home ownership or their car or whatever. These things matter. But also, they might own businesses, the education that you attain, the skills that you have, your friends and family, your business contacts, your networks that you can tap into are hugely important in getting ahead in the economy, but they're not equally distributed. Not everybody has the same access to an old boys club or a school network. There's nothing wrong with networks, but they're not equally distributed, and yet the importance of these networks is not captured if we look just at income. People are not the same. Personal attributes, people's concentration, people's drive, people's intellect is not equally distributed. But that's not fully taken account of. There's an assumption that everybody can be given more education and training, everybody can be pushed into the labour force to do mainstream jobs where it's not always going to be possible for everybody. People's free time is an asset, and people have less and less of it. Public goods, commons, libraries, other public facilities that are just freely available that we can all use are an important facility, again, that's not equally distributed, that not everybody has the same access to, and that in many cases are under decline as libraries close, libraries have shorter hours. And if we take our family from earlier, what can assets do? They can generate income, they can lower your cost of living, they can lessen risk and help you deal with emergencies, so short-term loss of income. So if you have cash and you lose your job, you can see yourself through without, too much strain in terms of paying your mortgage. If you're a homeowner and you have a low mortgage, well then you're in a much better situation than somebody who has to then rent at a high level in the economy. If you've got a higher education, it's much easier for you in so many ways. But you also have the skills to maybe do more with less in terms of how you manage your money. Although most people, 99%, are extremely good at managing money. But if you have relatives, they might help you with childminding costs. Again, dynamics which are not captured by the economy. The cost side is equally complicated, but the way I want to address this is to say that everybody needs to meet some basic physical, psychological and social needs. That's captured as a minimum essential standard of living. It's a standard method. It's used to calculate a living wage. And these are example of 16 categories: food, clothing, housing, transport, energy, the things that people need. At a very basic level, these are not about meeting people's wants, it's about meeting the minimum needs so people can function in our society at a minimum level, based on an idea of human dignity. So we mentioned equivalised income, but it doesn't capture all of the complexities. You know, the need for what happens if markets are deregulated or subsidies are withdrawn, how that affects the cost of living. Indirect taxes like VAT and excise, they affect people on lower incomes more because they pay more indirect taxes. So we see a shift from taxing incomes to taxing stuff. But of course those taxes affect people on lower incomes more. Access to credit is a big deal. It's a big difference from having a credit card to not having any credit. So one extra bill, one medical expense can drive you over the edge. You have to borrow money from a money lender or a payday loan, and then you're into a cycle of trying to repay that. Or just even if you have a credit card, getting into trouble with your debt, it can spiral out of control. And if you don't have anybody who can bail you out, our legal system, which is also 19th century, will put the borrower under enormous pressure and they'll be squeezed to repay. And of course, it's people on the lowest incomes who pay most for credit. And the debt cycle, dependent children and adults, the equivalisation doesn't really cover it because of the spectrum of needs people have. Many people look after elderly relatives, siblings, looking in on their neighbours. All this value is created, but it's not captured in our models. Disability can increase people's costs enormously, from the cost of medicines and devices through to transport costs and much, much more. And of course the role of unpaid work in our society. So many things are just not adequately captured. How do we meet our needs? Well, we can use our income after tax. We can buy them in the market individually. That has benefits in terms of choice. There are efficiencies in that. But at the same time, we can also pay our taxes, get our needs met collectively through universal public services. There's economies of scale. We're bulk purchasing here. And of course, there's solidarity. Public services are there for everyone, so they benefit people on lower incomes more. Although there's now an increase in a focus on means-tested public services, which are only available to those on the lowest incomes. So a filtering of who gets to access public services, which is a phenomenon of recent decades. So if people lower your taxes and you have more net income, you still have to meet all these needs out of your own pocket. And yet the debate has been skewed very much against taxation and public services in favour of markets. But markets don't always make sense in many cases, particularly health and social care. It's not to say you can't innovate and be efficient with money and so on, but the idea that everything should be individualised, and of course those who are most in need of solidarity are those on the lowest incomes. How I understand why are people so against taxes? Well, politicians cut our taxes, promise us lower taxes. There's lower service provision. People see that services are of lower quality. Maybe they have to pay a fee, so they have to pay more out of their pocket. They perceive that services are not worth the money. So they're either unwilling to pay more taxes or indeed unable to pay more taxes because of the higher cost in the market. And so there's a political demand for lower taxes. And it's a vicious cycle that goes round. And to break that, you need to take action on all three sides at the same time, which of course is difficult to do. So what I'm really saying as I come to a close is that we cannot artificially separate economics from wider society. Many people meet their needs through social behaviour that is not captured or measured, and indeed probably can't be. My idea of a holistic measurement of economic inequality is really trying to capture some of the qualitative, subjective, hard to measure things and simply remind us that they're there. We might not ever be able to quantify them and put them into some supercomputer, and maybe nor should we, because they involve so many value judgments. But we have to remember that they're there, and that many people have always met their needs outside of the money economy. Money doesn't need to change hands. And of course, if we focus on the money, focus on incomes within that, We risk squeezing people's free time as people are working 24 hours a day through email and phone calls and being on call, working from home into the small hours. And of course, there's also a part of the economy which serves no useful social function, such as high-speed electronic trading of dividends and futures and so on, which is just parasitical and is simply a result of because they can, because it's not unlawful to do. So there's the model again, which is some of the detail in it. We're nearly there. I'm conscious of time. Towards solutions. We don't have all the answers, but we have some signposts of where we can go. I just have 3 more slides. We have some general principles of how you deal with complex social problems, formally complex problems. Holistic thinking, a comprehensive strategy, the need to be innovative and flexible, working across agencies, and indeed working. It's not just, this is not a public sector solution. You need public sector, businesses, voluntary organisations, families, individuals, all have to be convinced to change their ideas and change their behaviour if we as a society are going to actually tackle economic inequality and regard it as important. I mean, so we need to engage everybody. That's going to require new skills, new knowledge. Policymakers need to get in on this. And we've got to accept, as I said it before, we can't measure everything. We're not going to have a perfect set of key performance indicators to tell us every month if we're going in the right direction. We've got to tolerate that a lot of this is going to be variable. There are a lot of complex trade-offs between this policy and that policy. My suggestion is that we need policies that are going to address all of these 3 things. Bearing in mind there will be trade-offs. If we raise taxes, we're going to lower your net income, but we might be able to reduce your cost of living. Or we might be able to build up your security of tenure as a renter or a homeowner. Or we might be able to support parents who care in the home or carers better. So again, there's a complex interaction here. Some policies will have trade-offs, but we need to look at the whole picture. And of course, the goal has to not be economic growth, but that everybody should have a minimum essential standard of living. If we take that as at least our first goal, to get everybody over the line in terms of a decent minimum, which of course many people are not, then that's the overview that allows us to then have specific policies on each of these dimensions. There's a lot more we could say about it, but ultimately this holistic idea of economic benefits, again, we're now getting into philosophical ideas about what is the good life, well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, subjective things involving different preferences, different value systems that people have. We don't all share the same vision of a good life. But if people are going to have a chance of achieving a good life in their own terms, they're going to need a basic material standard of living, a fair share of economic resources, a minimum share, which in turn allows them to develop the capacities, the capabilities they need to have a fair shot at having a good life. And all of that has to be achieved on a planet which is running out of time. So, thank you.